You doing? You guys good?
All right. My name is Dave DeWalt. I'm the founder and CEO of Knight Dragon, and I'll introduce the senator in just 1 minute because it takes me 49 minutes to introduce him as part of our session. But he has a long, amazing career I want to tell you about. But first of all, I just want to say it's an honor to be here at RSA. Had a chance to do a keynote this morning as well, which was fun, and then do 3 hours of streaming on NASDAQ's tower, which was fun. I get to introduce 10 really hot cyber companies. So I feel like I have the greatest job in the world doing investments and advisory to the cyber world. This is my 20th RSA. Anybody been to more than 20? Stop it. More than 20? All right. Got me. But it's amazing to watch the cyber community grow, and it's been an honor for me to be a part of the cyber community for a long time. I was originally CEO of a company called Documentum that did secure document management, and my company got bought by EMC. We acquired a company called RSA, which happened to be my first RSA conference in 2004, so somewhat serendipitous to be here. And then I became CEO of McAfee. Anybody heard of that company? Yeah, most people say it's McAfee, not McAfee, but it's technically McAfee. And then I became chairman of 2 cool companies, Mandiant and FireEye, and became CEO of FireEye, bought Mandiant, took it all public. And now I do investments into national security and cybersecurity. I've served 4 administrations with the White House on NSTAC, and I currently serve as vice chairman of Homeland Security CISA with Jen Easterly, director of Easterly. So a lot of public service on my side. Senator Warner, drop that doesn't help. Senator Warner graciously gave us our time today, so we have a wonderful opportunity. At the end, I'll take some questions, a couple. So think of a really smart question to ask, if you would, for us. But Senator Warner is an incredible resource for us all here in the world of cybersecurity and national security. I think everybody knows. This man is not only a technologist, having come from the telecommunication industry with Nextel and other companies, and then a governor from 2002 to 2006, and now has served 3 terms plus as senator for Virginia and chair of our intelligence committee and also chair of the cyber caucus as well. So my opinion, and this is my opinion, one of the most technical senators, business-oriented senators, and knowledgeable cyber and national security people ever to serve the United States. So thank you so much, Senator, for joining us. Give him a big round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, being the technical guy in the U.S. Senate is being like the one-eyed man in the land of the blind. So,
yeah, don't quote that. Rules today. No, I'm joking. Let's start a little bit. I start out by saying this, and I want to hear Mark's comments about this. But for one guy who's been in this for 20 years, post-pandemic, it's been an incredible world, right? I mean, at least for me, I'm on the board of Delta Airlines. I chair safety and security for the airline as well. And I just got to see so many things happen since the pandemic. And, whether you call it nationalism or, sort of geopolitical tensioning starting to rise, the cyber threats that have occurred, the regional wars that have now broken out. I mean, wow. I always say, may we live in interesting times is a blessing and a curse. We're kind of in that interesting times that are occurring around the world. And I partaked with over 5,500 confirmed Chinese thefts of intellectual property on American companies during my time at Mandiant and FireEye. I got to be on the front line of seeing a lot of egregious attacks and threats and issues that have occurred. And just watching where we're at today as we sit here, 2024, is some days ominous. But we have a lot of heroes and people that work together, public-private partnership, particularly the senator, to help us. Maybe start out with a little, what are you seeing around the world? And just help the audience kind of feel what you've seen for 20-some years as a senator and governor and, kind of summarize it.
It's kind of like, it's good news, bad news. I don't think there's any nation state that came out of COVID better, frankly, than America. And I say that, on the economic numbers. I say that on the basis of if we'd gone back 2 years ago and there was a great debate of who was going to lead the AI revolution. Was Kai-Fu Lee going to be right and say who had the most data, compute, and engineering power would win? I think That's not been the case. I think we continue to out-innovate. I think what you guys do in the cyber domain is extraordinarily important, and I thank you for what you do, because if what I've tried to do, particularly over the last 10 or 12 years, is redefine national security. Because I think in 2024, national security is not simply which nation has the most tanks, guns, ships, and planes, but it is who is going to be dominant and the most successful in technology. And we have never faced, Russia was always a military threat, an ideological threat, but was never really a technology or economic challenge. In China, we face the greatest economic and technology competitor I think our country's ever faced. And let me be clear at the outset, China is a great nation, and the Chinese people are great people, and no bias against that, or obviously the Chinese diaspora, which has hugely contributed to our country. But I have a real problem with CCP and President Xi Jinping and how he basically, I think in that 2012 to 2015 timeframe, made a calculated decision that said, enough with market, enough with any kind of democracy reforms, that maintaining CCP preeminence was going to be the most critical component of how he was going to compete. And as somebody who kind of grew up in the wireless industry, it was a real wake-up call for me when founder of Nextel and started in the early 80s in wireless, to suddenly look around and say, not only did America not even have a competitor in 5G, but China was basically clearing the field with Huawei, and there was a national security threat there. And that led us on the Intel committee to kind of look at that. That led us then to John Cornyn and I, a senator from Texas, put together the CHIPS bill as we morphed into the questions around who's going to lead in semiconductors. Our committee has taken on that notion of how we redefine national security. We're doing deep dives on emerging energy technology, how we're going to secure critical mineral supply. I'm a big believer if we're going to empower all the data centers that AI is going to create, you got to do more than solar and wind, so I'm a big advocate for SMRs. We're looking as well at issues like bio. I really feel, as a former telecom guy, that the next wave where China is frankly out investing is bio. When you combine bio and AI, I think the potential breakthroughs are enormous. And then in what you guys do within the cyber domain, we have seen from all of our competitors, particularly post-COVID, a much more aggressive and brazen efforts. And as we all know, particularly from our traditional adversaries of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, many times they may be GRU agent by day and cyber criminal by night. And where that line blurs, at the end of the day, I think the authoritarian regimes, frankly, enjoy the fact that many of these attacks are foisted by folks who are not simply cyber criminals, but they are still indirectly, I think, at least indirect agency of the national agenda from particularly China, Russia, and Iran. So I think we've got our work cut out for us. I do think on these issues, there is still broad bipartisan agreement, and that's a good piece of news. But I think some of the policy debates that we're going to have to take on, and I know we'll get through a bunch of questions here, is as China in particular, China, Russia in particular, just within what's in open source, more and more penetrate our critical infrastructures across a variety of fields. I think we're going to need to step up our game as well in terms of how willing we are to have an open conversation about what type of offensive capabilities. We abide by rule of law, our adversaries don't, but it may be a time for that kind of conversation.
Thank you for summarizing that. I want to stay on the China topic for a minute and bigger threats and risk, but I'll tell a one minute story. My company, Night Dragon, you can look it up. It's named after a famous Chinese attack on the oil and gas industry, which was that immediately succeeded a bigger attack called Aurora. So Operation Aurora, some of you might know, was a seminal moment in cyber history, at least for me. I was CEO of McAfee. We sort of woke up one day and we realized there was large APTs deployed in a lot of our high-tech companies. At that time, 153 companies were confirmed with long dwell times, over a year dwell times And most of them lost their source code. Most of them lost their bug databases. Most of them lost their IP. Famous one, Google pulled out of China. It was a large situation. And fast forward to what Senator's talking about is we've been in a pretty interesting, not just cyber arms race, but almost cyber warfare with China, leading up to even recently, if some of you follow Volt Typhoon, and watching TDPs change a little bit from what potentially was espionage and stealing IP to, as part of Belts and Roads, to up-level their IP and compete against America, to potentially disrupting and destroying infrastructure in America as well. And that TDP change was very fascinating. Talk a little bit about China for a minute specifically, if you would. I know you've been very passionate about this area, maybe even how it relates to their technology like TikTok and other things that are going on, and wherever you want to go with China
Sure.
specifically for a minute, because
Well,
this is a big one.
You know, again, China is enormous economic and technology challenge. And as you said, you know, well documented, about $500 billion a year of intellectual property theft. So I do think, and one of the fascinating things, and again, going back to my days as a venture guy, you know, I was all in on greater collaboration with China. And as a governor, I was all in on more university exchanges. That changed, again, in that 2012 to 2015 timeframe. And I think there was, and what we started on the Intel committee, because every day I'd come into a classified brief and hear another story that kind of was jaw-dropping about how we weren't staying up in some of these technology domains, and also, again, the very aggressive nature of Chinese tech. So we started something called the Classified Roadshows, where we, starting in 2017, and started taking industry sector by industry sector to say, no, don't decouple, but at least go in eyes wide open. Interesting enough, virtually every industry sat down with us, with the exception of private equity, at least pre-COVID, because I think some of those firms didn't want to hear the stories because they were making so much money in some of this Chinese tech. In my day job, you know, there's months and months where a lot of stuff doesn't get done. And then all of a sudden, you've got to be always ready. And I've actually had a pretty good last couple of weeks, because within the last 3 weeks, the Senate overwhelmingly, based on things that already happened in the House, renewed FISA in Section 702, which is a absolutely critical component of our national security apparatus, and, you know, and frankly, with a series of reforms. So again, this tool that can be used on how you surveil foreigners abroad, but also make sure you don't have inadvertent contact with Americans. I think we have made some major reforms there, but that was about to go dark, and we literally had to report that there were a number of telecom companies that were no longer going to work with the government if that went dark.
Congratulations on that,
was a
by
big,
the way. I thought that was incredible.
It was sausage making at its most extreme. Then, you know, on TikTok, I started a year ago with huge concerns on TikTok. And let me, again, preface it by saying, I also have huge concerns on American social media platforms writ large. I think our failure to put any guardrails, from simple things like data portability, interoperability, you know, prohibiting dark patterns, having a privacy bill, you know, are all things that we need to come back to. And I do think kids' online safety will get. But the TikTok issue, you know, if we sat back and said, what would we allow another nation state that is at least somewhat adversarial to us come in and be able to scrape 170 million Americans' data on a pretty regular basis, and at the same time potentially become the largest and most powerful propaganda tool in this country? The 170 million Americans, 90 minutes a day, that is more than the combined power of Fox and MSNBC, so pick your poison, but in terms of potential influence. And we've seen some of that, and, you know, we can't get into all the classified part, but in a place where I work, on the House side, which is a little more ideologically diverse, much more bipartisan, but ideologically diverse, there was a briefing to the Energy and Commerce Committee, and after that briefing, they voted 50-0. You couldn't get 50-0 to agree the sun's coming up in the east, you know? To say, and this is not a ban, there's a lot of creativity on TikTok, there is, I think it's great that social influencers can make their living off of that, but this ought to be a divestiture. At the end of the day, you know, China would never allow any of our platforms in with that kind of both data accumulation and, almost more importantly, that ability to kind of shape our dialogue and our political debate. So I think that took place. Also at the same time, we did something that was, I think, also absolutely essential, was to provide additional aid in terms of how we think about China and Taiwan, the kind of both humanitarian aid to Gaza, but support for our ally Israel, but also finally step up and do what was the right thing on Ukraine. I think if we had not continued to fund Ukrainians, it would have been a mistake of historic proportions, similar to what Chamberlain did appeasing Hitler prior to World War II. And one of the things, as an advocate of stepping up for Ukraine, I think we didn't do a good enough job. You know, what we have done in helping Ukraine with less than 3% of our defense budget on a 2-year run basis, the Ukrainians, with that help and European help, literally have taken out 87% of Russia's pre-existing ground forces, 63% of their tanks, pre-existing. Russia's building more, 32% are armored personnel carriers. And we've not put NATO or Americans in conflict. If we hadn't done this, no country would ever trust us to get into the world. So for a period, you know, maybe in 2 weeks in Congress, and these all have been signed by the president now, we did more than all of 2023 combined, and I think that preps us a little bit in terms of how we think about national security as we think about competition in these technology domains. And then more specifically on China, I think there is a extraordinary opportunity. I think there are many nation states around the world that I think got enthralled with the Belt and Road Initiative from China a number of years back. And I think you've got a lot now of dissatisfied customers. You know, many nation states, Asia and Africa, thought they were going to get a lot of jobs on the infrastructure China was going to build. China brought their own workforce in. The quality of infrastructure was not that great, and the country still ended up in a great deal of debt. I do think for all the flaws in this country, we still have allies. China has clients. And I think there's a chance here for us to kind of rebuild some of those alliances, both in terms of how we deploy technology, how we make our communities more safe. Some of it starts with as simple as when we talk about this challenge, any policymaker ought to never use the term America and the West or America and NATO, because every time you do that, you piss off 2/3 of the rest of the world, who frankly, throughout Asia, throughout Africa, South America, I think we have potential to build stronger alliances with. So I feel better than a few years ago on this challenge, but I do think as we think about these other technology domains that will follow behind AI and elsewhere, we may have to do similar kinds of initiatives like a CHIPS initiative. And I'm a markets guy, I'm not generally an industrial policy guy, but when your competition is operating on a total non-market basis, and with virtually unlimited funding to subsidize their select industry, you gotta grapple with that. And frankly, without CHIPS, we would never built another fab in this country. I think the jury's still out. Will it be as successful as I hope? But I absolutely believe if we had not done that, we would be in a much, much more vulnerable position, particularly when we think about all the cutting edge and bleeding edge chips dependence coming all out of Taiwan.
Yeah, I want to come to that. If I can go back to TikTok for a minute and maybe, Senator, have you think about the problem a little more broadly than TikTok. And 1 minute again, which is in 2016, CEO FireEye, we witnessed the election process and we uncovered quite a bit of what we now call cognitive warfare, basically psychological information influence warfare. This particular was GRU influencing a lot of our elections, targeting battleground states, setting up bot farms, driving massive influence into the community to create a outcome for the President of the United States. We put out a report during that time period, but going back to 2016, we've now watched this ramp up. And misinformation, disinformation, generative AI, TikTok's ability to reach 170 million Americans for 90 minutes a day on average. I mean, this is a broad problem coming out of the World Economic Forum in Davos. What was the #1 existential threat they showed short term? Misinformation, disinformation, and what do we do about it? And how does government partner with some of these private companies who control hundreds of millions, billions of people's impressions and capabilities? As chair of the Intelligence Committee and what you look at, how do you think about this problem
great
in this broader area?
And again, maybe a bit self-serving, it was our Intelligence Committee that did that whole investigation into Russian intervention. I still remember shortly after the election saying, I think we've got Russian presence on Facebook. And some of the Facebook leaders said, those politicians are so stupid. They don't understand anything. They had to eat some of those words later. And we did a 3.5-year, completely bipartisan investigation into Russian interference. And as Dave, as you said, this was not simply some benign one-off bot farms. This was literally urging Americans to get into physical altercations. There was a case where they had a fake set of bot farms that were promoting, protecting Muslims who live in Texas. There was a counter group about Texas secessionists. They put together an event where these two groups were going to clash in Houston, and but for police intervention, American blood would have been spilled. So some of the rewriters of history that said, that really wasn't that big a deal, it's just factually wrong. I'd point to 4 volumes of our investigation. So I think we've exposed a little bit, but now let me give you the bad news. I fear, and I'm a Democrat, was not totally supported by any means of all the things that Trump did, but in many ways I think in 2020, with the Trump team, we may have been better protected than we are for elections that are coming 6 months from now here in America. And why would I say that? Because 4 reasons. One, the tools that Russia used, other nation states, adversaries, and even some that are not full adversaries of ours, but quasi-adversaries, but particularly China, Russia, Iran, have said to interfere in our elections is relatively easy, and it's a lot cheaper than buying an aircraft carrier. So they are out there. Secondly, unfortunately, and this is, as somebody who got involved in cell phones back in the 80s, I'll take partial responsibility on this. As we use these social media platforms so insidiously, many Americans believe a lot more crazy stuff and accept conspiracy theories at a level today that was totally unprecedented 4 years ago, 8 years ago. Third thing is, and this is kind of a nerdy one-off, but it was really, really debilitating, was there was a court case in the Fifth Circuit that got taken to the Supreme Court that literally said there should be no voluntary communications between American government, law enforcement, or others, and the social media companies. That would be crazy in the 2020 cycle. If we saw, again, this is foreign interference, we had enough domestic back and forth. We shouldn't be touching that from the incel side. But foreign-based interference, if we saw a pattern of behavior from the Russians, we could share that with social media and vice versa. We went for 6 months until this case was argued before the Supreme Court with no contact at all. So we are putting those communications back in place. And then finally, we've got the enormous power of AI, and not just with deep fakes, but a whole host of tools that can bring speed and scale into disinformation tactics at a way that's totally unprecedented. And I am worried. I mean, there was one step that back at the Munich Security Conference in February, because I'm not sure whether we're going to get actual legislation in place, although we can come back to that. We got 20 of the biggest tech companies in the world, including TikTok, X, and Twitter, and all the normal suspects, and new AI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, to agree, since half the world was going to elections this year, we have real-time elections going on right now in India, EU elections in June in Europe, our elections obviously in the fall, to say these companies would all voluntarily agree on common watermarking on AI products, be willing to kind of work to take those altered products down in terms of AI in elections, and try to do a job of educating. It was a nice press conference. I was there. I was very supportive. We're 60, 70 days later, and I'm not sure there's been near enough progress in having those voluntary commitments actually be met. And one of the things we're going to press the companies on is, show us the beef. What have you done, and what are you doing real time to make sure, at least on the AI tools, we've got some protection.
Senator, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing as the new and up-and-coming biggest threats. And we talked a little bit about misinformation, disinformation, and that problem for a minute. We'll just park that for a second. But other types of threats that you're starting to see that we need to prepare ourselves for, particularly as a private industry too. I'll give you a little my view. I see the future of cyber hacking not being done through files and malware and spear phishing, right? For the last 20 years, what did we defend against? Some sort of spear phish, click on an email, click on a malicious payload, infect your computer, move laterally, steal credentials, basically steal and exfiltrate data. It's been like a common model. Sometimes we'll use a 0-day to do that in some way. The future, in my opinion, is cyber hacking with radio frequencies, with RF, with electromagnetic capabilities. We're starting to see more and more threats coming where I can hack your device through RF. It could be done. I could disrupt an aircraft, a GPS spoofing or poisoning scenario. I could do things that really we didn't do before in traditional cyber ways. AI is also bringing the art of the possible here. Quantum's creating another one behind it. Senator Tuck, you have such a technology background. Like, what's keeping you up tonight? I heard Admiral Stavridis talk about swarm drones coming and swarm intelligence and things happening there that could age our Navy fleets faster. What's keeping you up? How do you think about that problem?
All of the above, but you're right on the RF piece as a wireless guy. You're right, the nature of warfare is literally being rewritten in the Ukraine-Russia conflict now in terms of drones. And while there's, and this is somewhat in the public domain, there are some American citizens literally trying to make sure that the drone swarms, since the Russians have been pretty good at getting back to the controller through RF, electronic warfare jamming, whereby next iteration of that will be, there will be no controller, and you'll have it within the swarm enough intelligence so that if lead gets taken down, the command and control will go to the next person in the swarm and so on. That is on one side, yay, that we maybe give the Ukrainians a chance to really come back. The next breath you go, holy crap, holy heck, we're talking about autonomous weapons without any human control once launched. So I am concerned there. I am concerned, as I mentioned earlier, about our adversaries' penetration of some of our critical infrastructure, and that has been reported in open source. And I do, as I said earlier, think we ought to at least have a debate about not only how we counter that, but how we push back. In 2018, and Paul Nakasone, who I thought was the best as the head of NSA, took out, or is only Nakasone could do, obliquely reference the fact that some of the players who had started the 2016 interference in our elections, were taken down in 2018. I think as well, I worry, I've mentioned the bio and space in terms of not just the innovation, but biomanufacturing. And that's, again, an area where I see China a bit ahead. I would also say in the cyber domain, I've been talking for a couple years about the need for minimum standards in the healthcare sector. And now we see, the Change United Healthcare breach. And with United being the single biggest powerhouse in the healthcare space, if they can't take a company they acquired 2 years earlier and put in minimum cyber standards, holy heck, we got some problem there. And I've got a bill now that will say, hey, it's mandatory standards by a different definition. With the Change United Healthcare, the government will put out some short-term capital to make sure that providers didn't run out of dough because so shut down their billing operations. I would say on a going forward basis, we ought to continue to provide that short-term financing, but only for those entities that hit that minimum cyber standard in terms of healthcare. But our efforts to date, there's a couple places where we have passed bills, and I'm going to make two other points on this. One is where we have passed legislation, our ability to implement that legislation has been pretty poor. I spent a couple years, and I think we passed this back in like 2020, 2021, can't remember, to say before the Defense Department goes out and buys a gazillion IoT-connected devices, those IoT devices ought to have minimum cybersecurity standards. No embedded passcodes, ability to be fixed a little bit. That's the law of the land, and we still haven't implemented it. Or the legislation that we put in place, again, a couple years ago after SolarWinds, where we said, in the event of a major cyber breach or ransomware, we ought to at least let the government know. You don't have to call, the FBI although that really helps sometimes, you need to have to call, one of your regulatory agencies, at least let CISA know, so that information can be shared. And frankly, we went tooth and nail with the Chamber of Commerce, who were begging for a 5-year implementation. We still don't have those CISA standards out on how we make sure that notification. Last thing, and this is the probably only kind of audience that I can nerd out on this on, and that is, and this was again the wake-up call for me, was around 5G standards. One of the things that were the secret sauce of our country was, one, our innovation, but two, even if we didn't originally innovate it here, we got to set the standards, rules, protocols for technology. And with those standards and protocols, and we've seen it in compute, we've seen it in space, we've seen it obviously in wireless, we could put our values in those standards. Within tech standard values are represented as well. We have, I'm afraid that leadership in standard setting is receding. China again is flooding the zone on a lot of these standard setting bodies. Large corporate America has kind of said, well, we're not really sure it's worth the time to send our engineers to these standard setting bodies. Frankly, government has withdrawn a little bit too. And again, I've got some bipartisan efforts to say, hey, we need to get back in the game on the standard setting entities. And we're seeing that play out now, and again, kind of beyond 5G as we move to the ORAN, open radio access networks, and 6G. We got to be at the table on those things. So an area that does worry me, if we were to lose, I don't think we will lose our innovation, but if we lose some of the secret sauce we had around standard setting, that really concerns me.
Yeah, I can't agree more with you. By the way, for one guy who's been in this industry for a long time too, watching the progress that our government has made, partnering with private sector, public-private partnerships has come a long way in the last few years. It's really welcome. I mean, this is a team sport, cyber. Senator alluded to that. No private vendor, no security vendor can solve all this. The government can't solve it all either. But together we can be stronger, and the better we're able to create coalitions, caucuses together, work together to better. I, for one, welcome a lot of the legislation, particularly the SEC's mandates for incident reporting. I know that's a little shocking at times, and wow, what do I report? When's materiality really hitting a threshold? How do I figure this out? There's things to work through. But if you're a shareholder of one of these companies as well, and they're not reporting a breach of the magnitude of some of the ones that, like UnitedHealthcare's and others that we've seen, this is pretty substantial too. So the bar's moving, what's called JCDC, if you're not familiar with what the joint coalition of, I forget what JCDC stands for exactly.
Hey, you're throwing around
Joint
the acronyms.
Cyber
I'm not
Coalition.
sure I remember either, but I'm going to.
Always got a good acronym for everything in cyber. But we've made progress, and encourage more and more of that as we move forward. Talk about, if you will, Senator, just like what things can we be doing, public and private together, to be stronger? And what do you see from your angles for our side to work with you?
Well, one of the things, and again, this shows my bias, maybe having been a VC and a funder, is we got to really look at the capital stack. And we have obviously the healthiest funding community in the whole world. But within this kind of, if you accept my premise that the definition of national security has to extend to, particularly vis-a-vis where we're in technology competition with China, into AI, quantum, bio, SMRs, critical minerals, the list goes on. And frankly, China has had a list. One of the things America has never had is you go to OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology, they'll give you one list, Commerce will give you another, CIA will give you a third. But trying to have some agreement there on the capital stack of our government efforts to kind of support that. We've got In-Q-Tel, and I'm a huge, huge fan of In-Q-Tel. We've got DIUX, kind of, I think it's more of a work in progress of how you get into the kind of the DoD bloodstream as a within the contracting piece. But I'd love to explore some way, and I don't know if this, how we create kind of a coalition of the willing amongst funders. That doesn't mean you got to take a lower rate of return, But it does mean you think twice before you take your most innovative enterprise you're investing in, and you think twice before who you partner with on that investment. And CFIUS does a little bit of that, but it's also, there needs to be that kind of, we're in it together notion between entities. I'm going to spend a substantial amount of time, and I'm wide open for ideas on how we make that coalition willing without it becoming overly bureaucratic. I also think there is, I have grave concerns, and this goes back to my challenge and on my PE critique. Post-COVID, a lot of the PE firms did sit down with us because they got a little bit of religion when they saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the kind of extraordinary authoritarianism and how China dealt with COVID. And they'd seen enough of the intellectual property theft take place. But it bothers me that there are wide swaths of our investing economy, or not wide swaths, some parts of our investing economy that don't think about national security at all. I think there will be a lot of brand name players who are major investors in ByteDance, the company that controls TikTok. I would hope they would be forward leaning and say, you know what, we ought to help this transaction take place, because if we believe the creativity on TikTok and the social influencers, let's make sure that that ends up in an enterprise. It doesn't have to be American. It could be Brazilian. It could be French. But it just not to end up in an enterprise that is, I believe, indirectly controlled by the CCP. And we do need a framework, and one of this thing, and I had a bigger bill about a year ago that would have said for technology from China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, Cuba, nation states I'm not making up as our adversaries, that's in rule of law. We ought to have a broader-based process so we're not doing the whack-a-mole of Kaspersky one year, Huawei another, TikTok today, XYZ tomorrow. That got shot down, and it was like literally the far left and the far right that attacked that approach. And we had 26 senators, 13 Ds, 13 Rs. The president supported. But I do think we're going to need to come back to a framework where that foreign technology entity has their day of court and has a chance to make the case. But we're going to need that collaboration with the private sector across this.
I love what you said, Senator, about us all innovating together, right? The more we can collaborate public-private in investments, building companies from seed stage on up. In-Q-Tel is a fantastic example of this, Red Cell, a few others who have done some of this work in various areas. But we need more of that, in my opinion, and more collaboration. I want to ask you about one big problem, then I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. One of the areas I'm concerned about, and I'd like to hear the Senator's view, is cyber talent in America has become a bit of a problem. And talent all over the world, there's over 3.4 million open cyber jobs right now. It's a pretty high bar to get educated in cyber. I think you all know who's in the room. It takes a lot of experience, pragmatic learnings to get trained to the point where you're effective. Our university systems in America aren't quite equipped. There's a couple of universities who do a pretty good job of this, but we haven't systemically fixed infrastructure for training, not like two other countries have. Israel's been an amazing country when it comes to training their 18-year-olds into the IDF, teaching them cyber, creating entrepreneurials. China has now become a very powerful country when it comes to education, cyber warriors being produced, and America hasn't really kept up with that, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Senator Warner, how do we fix that? What can we do? Do you agree with that? And what can we do more with that?
I agree with that. Most important thing we should do is not lose the secret sauce that made this country such an innovative leader, which is the fact that we ought to welcome high school immigration. We're the only country in the world still that allows you to come and first generation be American. I could move to France tomorrow. I'm never going to be French. And the idea of continuing to attract the world's best talent here, and with some of the debate around immigration now, and yes, the border is a mess, but the border is partially a mess because people around the world would put their life in jeopardy to taste a little bit of the freedom and opportunity that we have in this country. We all take for granted. So let's not cut down on attracting best and the brightest around the world and not denigrate immigrants. I do think I've seen lots of cyber training modules. I'm surprised that we don't have a clear winner. As a former governor of Virginia, of those jobs, we had over a couple 100,000 openings. It got down a little bit, but starting salary $88,000, and for some of that not even being 4-year degrees. So I'm disappointed that we don't have any single state or any single federal government program that I can point to and say, here's the one that if we simply take to scale, we can meet these cyber needs. Third is, I worry as well that, and I'm happy to see as many of you got here and showed up for this. I worry that maybe it was because you couldn't get into the AI seminar next door. But let's face it, where's the biggest buzz right now? Where's the biggest job opportunity? Where's all of the energy? It's all around artificial intelligence. So how, and Lord knows we're going to need lots of talent there as well. How we crack this code on the cyber workforce, I've seen lots of programs. I've not seen the winner, and I'd welcome you, Dave, or I'd welcome anyone here. If you've got the winner idea, please help educate me, because I do think we could potentially bring some government resources to try to help that. But it is a critical problem. Although one thing, let me just, like one small, pitch that I think will help. I've always believed in network connectivity, and that, part of the promise of the interconnected age is you can build it anywhere. We've done a pretty crummy job of that in America in making it a reality of where you train and where you innovate. I think the single best thing that will have come out of the infrastructure bill from a few years ago, yes, it's roads, bridges, airports, rail, but if we don't get 98% of all Americans connected with high-speed, relatively affordable broadband in the next couple of years, that will be a failure of execution, because we've got plenty of money. And that ability to have that fully interconnected America suddenly gives the opportunity to provide the kind of technical training in a field like cyber for a whole lot of Americans that don't have access to that right now.
Love it. All right. Who's going to be brave to ask us a question up here? Yes, ma'am. There's microphones somewhere quite positioned. Thank you. Yep, there we go.
Well, two things. One is your comment about the shortage of people for security and the universities. Interestingly, the number of people who are going to universities now, women are over 60%, and men are more like 40%. If you look at this conference, it's about 95% men. So you see the future. If you don't encourage more women to go into this area, you're going to have even more shortages.
Well, can I make one quick comment on that?
Yes.
Coming out of COVID, we've seen good job growth numbers, but we've also seen amazing amount of new startups. That startup community, not just in cyber or tech, is almost entirely driven by women, and women of color, black women in particular, have disproportionately there. So we need to totally, and as a father of 3 daughters, amen to what you said.
Yeah. So my question is about deepfakes. I mean, more and more this is of concern. We've made huge advances in voice and visual, et cetera. And we certainly are seeing, and so we're seeing more and more concerns about it in politics, and you can think about it in virtually every single area. And conversely, you've got the liar's dividend. People can say, that wasn't me, I didn't say that, et cetera. So how do you, it's going to be an exploding problem. How do you see us fixing it?
Yeah.
Is there something legislatively we can do?
I think we need legislation that would mandate watermarking and have it be consistent across all fields. And there needs to be a public awareness campaign. I thought a year ago, when we were thinking about AI regulation, I thought, I got the perfect sweet spot. The intersection between deep fakes in destroying faith in public elections, but what is the other domain that they could have, if not the same, if potentially even greater ability to rob faith? Our faith in our public markets. If I was a bad guy using AI tools, I wouldn't go after a Fortune 100 company, but I go after a Fortune 200 to 500 company, and not only in terms of deep fakes of a CEO, but just product complaints that are invalid, or fake filings on the SEC. And I have not been able to get, I've got lip service from Wall Street so far on this, but no real action. I kept thinking we could have this grand alliance of small d Democrats and big C capitalists to put some ground rules in place. I'm not sure we're going to get that done, at least before the election, though.
The good news is we are starting to see a lot of next generation Gen AI security solutions right next door, of course, deep fake detections, also being able to secure the algorithms themselves, keep the weights and balances through the life cycle, prevent hallucinations, poisoning, other types of jailbreaking through the AI engines themselves. So, boy, do we got to move quicker. The gap is
And we also,
pretty,
and part of that,
pretty
we
big.
also make sure we add to that, the same things that already taken place in digital copyright, prevent the anti-circumvention events. So even if you have those watermarking, then if you've got a technology that strips that watermarking and other thing away, we need that anti-circumvention.
Let's jump over to this side.
And I'll make shorter questions or shorter answers
Yeah.
since I think we've.
Biliana, go ahead.
Yeah, Senator Warner, great to meet you. My name is Biliana. I'm with the RAND Corporation and soon moving to the Department of Energy. And first, I wanted to thank you for all the work you did around the interference in the 2016 elections with the Intelligence Committee. I believe, if memory serves me right, the committee published about 5 reports on the interference that were super detailed.
Right.
One of them, I think, was about 1,000 pages. If you wondered if anyone outside of the Beltway read them completely, I did, from cover to cover.
Well,
They were
God bless you,
excellent.
because I'm not, I can guarantee I don't think that many of my colleagues read them all.
Well, they were really good, and thank you for that. So my question is about Russia and China and potential cooperation in cyberspace. We hear a lot that both Russia and China are trying to establish foothold in our critical infrastructure, specifically energy and telecommunications. And we also recently heard from the US intelligence community that they're cooperating more militarily and even looking at a scenario for the invasion of Taiwan together. Do you envision the possibility of them cooperating in cyberspace against US critical infrastructure?
Yes.
How worried should we
Yes.
be about that?
We should be. And, I remember in the Ukraine debate, and I'll be brief because people are still lining up, and I know we're losing folks to the next session. I had some other folks who said, well, I don't really care about Putin being successful in Ukraine, even though that would mean he would not stop at Ukraine. But I'm really concerned about President Xi in China. If you don't get the fact that there is an alliance of authoritarian regimes, and one wins, the others win as well, you're flunking geopolitics 101. And at the same time, as we think about this, we need to do more partnering with India, with Japan, with Israel, with other nation states, and again, not just in the traditional kind of 20th century alliance set post-World War II NATO, where a lot of this innovation and talent is taking place as well, because in many countries, there may be similar kind of intervention from the adversaries into critical infrastructure in other nation states as well.
Thank you.
My apologies, but we're out of time, and I know all of you have some really interesting questions, and we could be here for a while. But we do have ways for you to ask your questions, and I'm not sure 100% exactly which way that is, but if you see one of the RSA personnel, we can get your questions for you later. Everybody, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciation for Senator Warner. Have a wonderful August.